The Watcher Next Door, a story of assumptions, secrets, and consequences. Chapter 1. A concerned neighbor. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon in Maple Glen, a neighborhood that prided itself on manicured lawns, friendly waves, and a sense of security that bordered on smugness. Mildred Hensley sat by her front window, a glass of iced tea sweating in her hand, as she did most days. To the casual observer, she was simply enjoying the sunshine. But anyone who knew her, really knew her, understood she watched. Constantly. She told herself it wasn't nosiness. She was just vigilant. She knew which cars belonged where, which kids cut through whose yards, and who took their garbage out early. She made mental notes about unfamiliar vehicles and unfamiliar faces, cross-referencing them against her mental directory of neighborhood information. Mildred was a one-woman neighborhood watch, and as far as she was concerned, the community was better for it. But today, something caught her attention that made her sit forward. A gray SUV she didn't recognize slowly pulled into the driveway of the old Miller house. The Millers had moved out 6 months ago, and as far as Mildred knew, the house was still vacant. No one had mentioned a buyer at the last HOA meeting, and she would have known if there had been any recent showings. The vehicle came to a smooth stop. Out stepped a black man in his late 30s, dressed casually in dark jeans and a navy sweater. He walked to the back of the SUV, popped the trunk, and pulled out 2 boxes. His movements were calm, unhurried. Too casual, she thought. He didn't look like a delivery driver. No uniform, no clipboard, no signs of anyone helping him move in. It didn't sit right with her. Mildred's thumb hovered over her phone as she squinted through the blinds. Maybe he was a contractor? But there hadn't been a for sale sign out front for weeks. Then she saw it. The man took out a key. He slipped it into the lock and opened the door. He stepped inside like he owned the place. Her heartbeat picked up. She knew what this looked like, and she told herself it had nothing to do with race. "It's about safety," she murmured, as if saying it aloud made it more true. What if he was squatting? What if he was breaking in? Maple Glen was peaceful, and she wasn't about to let that change. She picked up her phone and dialed. 911. "What's your emergency?" Mildred's voice was steady. "Yes, I'd like to report a suspicious person. A man just entered a vacant home on Sycamore Lane. I don't think he's supposed to be there. Can you describe the individual?" Mildred hesitated, just for a second. Black male, medium build, driving a gray SUV. He used a key to go inside. There was a pause on the line. "You're saying he used a key?" "Yes," Mildred said, a little sharper now. "But the house has been empty for months. I don't know if he's supposed to have one." "We'll send officers to check it out," the dispatcher replied. Mildred ended the call with a satisfied nod. She wasn't accusing him of anything, not really. She was just being careful. She was just being a good neighbor. Chapter 2. Arrival. Minutes later, the sound of sirens broke the afternoon stillness. Mildred's pulse quickened as she watched the police cruiser pull up behind the gray SUV. 2 officers stepped out, hands hovering near their belts. The man appeared again at the front door, a box tucked under one arm. He stopped in his tracks as he saw the police. Mildred leaned in closer, straining to hear, but their words were lost in the distance. She saw the man lower the box slowly, his other hand raised as he spoke to the officers. One of the officers pulled out a clipboard, looked through some papers, then glanced back at the man. After a moment, both officers relaxed visibly. Mildred's stomach twisted. They weren't arresting him. They weren't even handcuffing him. Instead, they shook his hand. One of the officers nodded before they both turned to walk away. Her curiosity overwhelmed her embarrassment. She needed to know what had happened. Chapter 3. The introduction. Feigning casualness. Mildred slipped out the front door and wandered down to her mailbox. She flipped through envelopes she didn't really look at. Stepping closer to the action point, one of the officers spotted her and walked over. "Ma'am?" Mildred smiled politely. "I called about the man at the old Miller house. I was concerned. You know, the house has been empty for months." The officer sighed. "Ma'am, this is Mr. Anthony Ellison. He's the new owner. He just moved in today." Mildred blinked. "Oh, I didn't know the house was sold." "Anthony, Mr. Ellison crossed his arms, exhaling slowly. His tone was measured but edged with something deeper. Didn't realize I needed to check in with the neighborhood committee first. Mildred's face flushed. I was just trying to. You assumed I didn't belong. Anthony interrupted, his eyes steady. That's not what I said. Mildred protested weakly. You didn't have to, he replied. The officer glanced at her one last time. In the future, ma'am, we'd suggest talking to your neighbors before calling us. As the officers left, Mildred turned toward her house, her face burning. She hadn't meant for this to happen. She'd done what she thought was right, hadn't she? Chapter 4. A new perspective that night. Mildred tossed and turned. Anthony Ellison's words echoed in her mind. You assumed I didn't belong. The way he looked at her, like he knew something she didn't. The next morning, she peeked out her blinds. He was there, leaning against his SUV, looking directly at her window. Her chest tightened. How long had he been standing there? Was he waiting for her? Then it happened. Anthony walked up her driveway. Her doorbell rang. She hesitated but opened the door just enough to see him standing there, holding his phone. Morning, he said evenly. Thought I'd return the favor. You seem real interested in watching me. I figured I'd come by and say hello. Mildred's mouth felt dry. I'm not sure what you mean. Anthony's smile was tight, without warmth. See, I've got cameras. Full security system. Installed them before I moved in. Mildred's stomach dropped. He tapped his screen and turned the phone toward her. There was footage, clear footage, of her walking by his property, pausing, staring at his house. More than once. At night, Anthony's voice lowered. You called the cops on me, but I've got days of you snooping around my house. Mildred's fingers tightened on the edge of the door. I was just out walking, she managed to say. Every night? Same route. Same time. Anthony tilted his head. You sure about that? She had no answer. Chapter 5. The revelation. Anthony tucked the phone into his pocket. At first, I thought you were just another nosy neighbor. Then I did some digging. Mildred stiffened. What do you mean digging? This house sat empty for months, Anthony said, ignoring her question. But everyone around here already seemed to know who was supposed to move in. Who did you think you were waiting for? Mildred couldn't answer, because she had no answer. Or, maybe, because she already knew what he was implying, and it terrified her. Chapter 6. The fallout word spread fast in Maple Glen. The story of Mildred Hensley calling 911 on the new homeowner traveled from one porch to the next. Some neighbors defended her. She was just looking out for us. Others, not so much. But Anthony wasn't done. He attended the next HOA meeting. With receipts, footage, documentation. I moved here for peace, he told the room. But what I got was a lesson in judgment. The room was silent. Then he played the footage of Mildred's late-night walks. Her lingering stares. N01 spoke. And when he asked about the rumored waiting list for the house, the idea that someone else had been promised it, people looked at each other with uncomfortable glances. Chapter 7. The secret. It turned out the HOA president, Harold Stokes, had quietly been trying to reserve homes for certain buyers. White buyers. People Mildred thought of as good neighbors. Anthony's purchase disrupted that unspoken plan, and Mildred's call to 911. It was part of the old guard's unofficial strategy to make new neighbors feel unwelcome. But Anthony wasn't going anywhere. Chapter 8. A new day. Weeks later, Anthony's house was the most active on the block. BBQs, community events, conversations. Mildred stayed inside more. But one day, she found an invitation in her mailbox from Anthony. Neighborhood barbecue. No watchers, just neighbors. And that, for the first time, made her wonder, had she been watching or had she just been afraid? Epilogue. Lessons learned. Mildred showed up that day. Not everyone smiled, but Anthony did. Change isn't easy, but sometimes it starts with a simple step out the front door.